The dust settled on the horizon as Martha stepped down from the stagecoach, her blonde hair catching the late afternoon sun like spun gold. She clutched a worn carpetbag in one hand and a letter in the other, the paper creased from being read 100 times during her journey from Philadelphia. The driver tipped his hat and clicked his tongue, urging the horses forward before she could even thank him properly. Within moments, the coach disappeared into a cloud of red dust, leaving her alone on the main street of Redemption, Texas. The town was smaller than she'd imagined. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith's forge, and a scattering of weathered buildings lined the dusty road. A few curious faces peered at her from doorways and windows, but no one approached. She smoothed her traveling dress and looked down at the letter again, though she knew every word by heart. James Hartley, rancher, widower, seeking a wife to help raise his son and manage his household. The words had seemed like salvation when she'd answered the advertisement 3 months ago, after her father's debts had left her penniless and her prospects in Philadelphia had vanished like morning fog. She waited on the wooden sidewalk for nearly 2 hours, her carpetbag growing heavier with each passing minute. The sun crawled across the sky, and still no one came. Merchants closed their shops. The saloon began to fill with evening customers. A woman in a calico dress finally approached her, sympathy written across her weathered face. "You waiting for someone, dear?" "James Hartley. He was supposed to meet me here today. We're to be married." The woman's expression shifted to something between pity and knowing. "Ah, you're one of those mail-order brides. And he didn't show up." Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks. Perhaps he was delayed. Perhaps tomorrow. Perhaps. "But I've seen this before, honey. Sometimes these men get cold feet. Sometimes they find someone local. Sometimes they were never serious to begin with. You got money for a room at the boarding house." Martha's silence was answer enough. The woman sighed and patted her arm. "Come on then. You can stay with me tonight. We'll sort this out in the morning." But morning brought no James Hartley. Nor did the afternoon. Martha helped her hostess, Mrs. Patterson, with her washing and cooking to earn her keep, but by the third day, the truth was becoming unavoidable. She'd been abandoned, left stranded in a town where she knew no one, with barely enough money for a week's meals, let alone passage back east. On the 4th morning, Mrs. Patterson sat her down at the kitchen table with a cup of bitter coffee. "I've been asking around about Hartley. He's real enough, lives about 5 miles northwest of here. Has a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. But here's the thing nobody wants to say to your face. He does this. Every few months, he writes to one of those matrimonial agencies, gets a woman all the way out here, then never shows up to claim her. This is the 3rd girl in 2 years. Martha stared into her coffee cup, feeling the humiliation wash over her in waves. Why would he do that? Who knows what goes on in a man's head? Maybe he gets lonely and thinks he wants a wife, then changes his mind. Maybe he likes the idea better than the reality. Maybe he's just cruel. But listen, I can't keep feeding you for free forever. I'm barely making ends meet as it is. I understand. I'll find work somehow. There's not much work for respectable women in a town like this, if you take my meaning. Maybe the general store needs help, or you could take in mending." But the general store had no positions, and the handful of other businesses in town had no need for her services. By the end of the week, Martha was down to her last few coins and growing desperate. She sat on the porch of the boarding house that evening, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold, and made a decision. The next morning, she asked Mrs. Patterson for directions to the Hartley ranch. "What are you planning to do?" "I'm going to give Mr. Hartley a piece of my mind. He owes me that much, at least. He brought me all the way out here on false promises. The least he can do is look me in the eye." Mrs. Patterson looked doubtful but gave her the directions. Martha borrowed a horse and rode out before she could lose her nerve, following the creek northwest until she saw the ranch house in the distance. It was a decent-sized structure, wood and stone, with a covered porch and a barn nearby. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, and she could see a windmill turning slowly against the blue sky. As she rode closer, she noticed the disorder. Laundry hanging crooked and half-fallen from the line, weeds creeping up around the foundation, a broken fence rail leaning at an odd angle. She tied the horse to the porch rail and climbed the steps. Before she could knock, the door swung open, and a small boy stood there, all big dark eyes and shaggy brown hair. He wore pants held up with suspenders and a shirt with a button missing. "Are you another one?" he asked, his voice carrying a weariness that seemed far too old for his small frame. "Another one? Another lady come to marry Pa. He won't see you. He never does." Martha felt her anger crystallize into something sharp and cold. "Is your father here?" "He's out checking the fences in the south pasture. But you should just go. He'll never come out if he knows you're here. He'll just hide until you leave. I've come 5 miles, and I'm not leaving until I speak with him." "What's your name?" "Thomas." "Well, Thomas, I'm Martha. And I'm going to wait right here until your father comes home, even if it takes all day." The boy shrugged with the resignation of someone who'd seen this play out before. "Suit yourself. But you'll be waiting a long time. He knows how to stay gone." Martha looked past him into the house and saw the same disorder she'd noticed outside. Dishes piled high, dust on every surface, a general air of neglect. "When did you last have a proper meal?" Thomas shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Mrs. Chen from the next ranch overbrings food sometimes. Pa makes beans and bacon when he remembers." "What about vegetables?" "Fresh bread." The boy's expression was answer enough. Martha felt her anger shift, redirecting itself. Whatever James Hartley's failings as a man, he was clearly failing as a father too. "May I come in?" Thomas stepped back, and Martha entered the house. It was worse inside than she'd imagined. The main room served as kitchen and living area, and both were in a state of chaos. Clothes hung over chairbacks, boots lay scattered by the door, and the smell of stale coffee and unwashed dishes permeated everything. "Where's your mother?" Martha asked, though she already knew the answer. "She died when I was 4. I don't remember her much anymore." Martha set down her carpetbag and removed her riding jacket. She rolled up her sleeves and surveyed the disaster before her. She could leave, ride back to town, use her last few coins for the cheapest room she could find, and try to scrape together enough for passage east. Or she could do something useful while she waited for the coward who'd brought her here to show his face. She chose the latter. "Thomas, where do you keep your broom?" The boy pointed to a closet, looking confused. Martha retrieved the broom and a bucket and set to work. She swept the floors, sending clouds of dust out the open door. She heated water on the stove and washed every dish, pot, and pan. She found clean linens in a chest and changed the curtains, shaking out months of accumulated dust. She scrubbed the table until the wood grain showed through, and she organized the chaos into something resembling order. Thomas watched her with growing amazement, sometimes helping when she asked, sometimes just standing back and staring as his home transformed before his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" he asked as she washed the windows, letting afternoon sunlight stream into the room for what seemed like the first time in years. "Because it needs doing. And because I can't abide sitting idle when there's work to be done." She investigated the pantry and found it better stocked than she'd expected. Flour, lard, dried beans, potatoes, onions, a few cans of tomatoes, even some sugar and molasses. Clearly, James Hartley had money enough for provisions, even if he lacked the time or inclination to turn them into proper meals. "Do you have chickens?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. 8 hens and a rooster." "Show me." Thomas led her outside to a chicken coop that had seen better days. The hens clucked irritably as Martha shooed them off their nests and collected eggs. 7 eggs, all fresh. She also noted a vegetable garden that had gone mostly to seed, though a few hardy plants still struggled on: tomatoes, green beans, some herbs. "Your mother planted this?" she guessed. "Pa did, the first summer after she died. He said we needed to eat proper. But he doesn't tend it much anymore." Martha knelt and pulled a ripe tomato from the vine, still warm from the sun. "Well, someone should. These plants are survivors. They deserve better." Back in the kitchen, she started a pot of beans soaking and began preparing a proper supper. She made biscuits from scratch, her hands remembering the rhythm her mother had taught her. She fried chicken with flour and spices, made gravy, cooked green beans with bacon, and sliced the fresh tomatoes. The house filled with smells that made Thomas follow her around like a puppy, his stomach growling audibly. "When will Pa be home?" he asked for the 4th time. "I don't know, but we're eating whether he's here or not. Go wash your hands and face." Thomas obeyed, and Martha set the table properly, with plates and forks and even a jar of wildflowers she'd picked near the porch. When the food was ready, she called Thomas to the table, and they sat down together. The boy stared at his plate like he'd never seen so much food at once. Martha said a quiet grace and then nodded for him to eat. He needed no further encouragement, diving into the meal with an enthusiasm that told her everything she needed to know about how he'd been living. They were nearly finished when the front door opened and a man stepped inside. He was tall, lean, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled at his collar. He wore work clothes covered in dust, and his boots were caked with mud. He stopped dead when he saw Martha sitting at his table, his expression cycling through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been shame. "You're her," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm Martha Caldwell, the woman you invited here and then abandoned at the coach station." She kept her voice calm, but there was steel underneath. "The woman who traveled 2,000 miles based on your promises." James Hartley stood frozen in his own doorway, clearly debating whether to flee back outside. Thomas looked between them, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "Pa, she cooked supper. Real supper, like Ma used to make." "I can see that." James removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Miss Caldwell, I owe you an explanation. You owe me considerably more than that. But an explanation would be a start." He stayed near the door, as if ready to bolt. "I did write those letters. I meant them when I wrote them. But when it came time to actually meet you, to go through with it, I couldn't. Every time, I convince myself I'm ready, and every time I realize I'm not." "So you just abandon these women? Leave them stranded in a strange town with no money and no prospects?" "I send money to the boarding house," he said defensively. "Enough for passage back east. I wasn't at the boarding house by the time your money arrived, I'm guessing. I was staying with Mrs. Patterson out of charity because I couldn't afford even the cheapest room." James flinched. "I'm sorry. Truly. I'll pay for your passage home and compensate you for your time and trouble." "Pa, no." Thomas suddenly burst out. "She can't leave. Look at the house. Look at supper. It's been like this all day. The house is clean and the food is real and everything smells good and I'm not alone anymore." "Thomas, that's enough." "It's not enough. I'm tired of beans and bacon. I'm tired of dirt and being by myself while you're out working. I'm tired of you being sad all the time." The boy's voice broke, and tears streamed down his face. "She makes the house happy, Pa. Let her stay, please." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush stone. James stood with his hat in his hands, staring at his son with an expression of such profound pain that even Martha felt it. Thomas wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his chest heaving with suppressed sobs. Martha stood slowly, smoothing her skirt. "Thomas, why don't you go outside for a few minutes? Your father and I need to talk." The boy looked between them, then fled out the back door. Through the window, Martha could see him sitting on the porch steps, his small shoulders shaking. James finally moved, setting his hat on a peg and walking to the window to look out at his son. "I'm not a good father," he said quietly. "I know that. I try, but I'm failing him. You're failing yourself as well. And you're failing every woman you bring out here on false pretenses." "I know." He turned to face her, and she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the deep lines of grief and regret carved into his face. "My wife died 3 years ago. Fever took her in 4 days. Thomas was only 5. I thought I could manage alone, that I could be enough for him, but I'm not. He needs a mother. He needs a woman's touch in this house. He needs someone who knows how to make it a home instead of just a place to sleep. And yet every time you have a chance at that, you run away." "Because I'm afraid." The admission seemed to cost him something. Afraid of replacing her. Afraid of bringing someone new into our lives who might leave again, might die again. Afraid that I'll just fail another person the way I'm failing Thomas. Martha crossed her arms, studying him. He was younger than she'd expected, probably not yet 40. Handsome in a weathered way, with kind eyes despite the fear she saw in them. So instead you fail them preemptively. Very noble. He almost smiled at that. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone meek and grateful? Someone who'd accept your cowardice without question. I suppose I didn't think that far ahead. Martha walked to the stove and dished up a plate for him, setting it on the table with more force than necessary. Sit down and eat before it gets cold. We're going to discuss terms. Terms. I'm not getting back on that coach, Mr. Hartley. I have nothing to go back to. My father's debts consumed everything, and I have no family left in Philadelphia. I came here to make a new life, and that's what I intend to do. James sat slowly, looking at the food like he wasn't sure what to do with it. I don't understand. It's quite simple. You need help with this ranch and with your son. I need employment and a place to live. I'm proposing an arrangement. I'll stay here as your housekeeper. You'll pay me a fair wage, and I'll cook, clean, manage the household, and help care for Thomas. No marriage. No romance. Strictly business. He picked up his fork but didn't eat. Why would you want to stay after what I did? Because despite your considerable flaws as a human being, you clearly love your son. And he's a sweet boy who deserves better than what he's been getting. Also, I'm an excellent cook, as you're about to discover, and it would be a shame to waste such talent. James took a bite of the chicken, and his eyes widened. He took another bite, then another, eating with the same enthusiasm Thomas had shown. Martha poured him coffee and sat across from him, waiting. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. This is the best meal I've had since my wife died. I know. Thomas hasn't seen the house this clean in years. I know that too. You'd really stay? After everything. On my terms. Fair wages, my own room, and complete authority over the household and Thomas's upbringing. You run the ranch, I run the house. We maintain professional boundaries. James set down his fork and met her eyes. What if I write to another woman in 6 months? What if I get the nerve up again to actually go through with finding a wife? Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But Mr. Hartley, I'm going to be honest with you. You're not ready for a wife. You're drowning in grief and fear, and until you deal with that, you'll keep sabotaging yourself. What you need right now is help. What Thomas needs right now is stability. Let me provide that, and maybe, eventually, you'll be in a place where you can actually commit to someone. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. My wife's name was Sarah. She was kind and patient and so much better than I deserved. When she died, I thought I'd die too. But I had Thomas, so I kept going. I've just been going through the motions for 3 years, Miss Caldwell. I'm not sure I even remember how to be happy. Then it's time to learn again. And it starts with taking care of your son and your home properly. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face streaked with tears and dirt. Is she staying, Pa? James looked at his son, then at Martha, then back at his son. She saw the moment he made his decision, saw the resignation and relief war across his features. If Miss Caldwell is willing to put up with us, then yes. She's staying. Thomas let out a whoop of joy and ran to Martha, throwing his small arms around her waist. She stiffened for a moment, surprised, then gently patted his head. Thank you, Thomas whispered. Thank you for making the house happy. Martha felt something crack open in her chest, some long-sealed chamber of her heart. She'd come west looking for a husband and found something entirely different. A purpose, a place, a broken family that needed her in ways that transcended romance or marriage contracts. You're welcome, Thomas. Now, you need a bath, and then it's bedtime. Tomorrow we have a lot of work to do. That night, after Thomas was scrubbed and tucked into bed, After she'd cleaned the kitchen and prepared bread dough to rise overnight, Martha sat on the front porch in the darkness. The stars were brighter here than they'd ever been in Philadelphia, spread across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The air smelled of sage and dust and the distant promise of rain. James came out and stood nearby, not quite joining her but not quite keeping his distance either. "I'll pay you $15 a month," he said. "Plus room and board. If that's acceptable." "It's acceptable." "And Miss Caldwell?" "Thank you. I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm grateful for it. I'm not doing this for you, Mr. Hartley. I'm doing it for Thomas. And maybe a little for myself. I needed somewhere to belong as much as you needed help." He nodded and went back inside. Martha remained on the porch, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Cattle lowing in distant pastures, the windmill creaking, an owl calling from the barn. She thought about the life she'd left behind, the life she'd expected to find, and the life she was building now from unexpected pieces. In the morning, she woke before dawn and started the fire in the stove. She made biscuits and gravy, fried eggs and bacon, and set the table. When Thomas stumbled out of his room, rubbing sleep from his eyes, he stopped and stared at the spread before him. "Is this real?" he asked. "You're really staying?" "I'm really staying. Now wash up for breakfast." James came in from the barn, where he'd been doing the early morning feeding. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, the clean kitchen, the hot breakfast, his son's radiant smile. Something shifted in his expression, some small crack in the wall he'd built around himself. They ate together, the three of them, and though they were still strangers in many ways, there was something like family in the way they passed the biscuits and shared the butter. Thomas chattered about his plans for the day, about showing Martha the swimming hole down by the creek and the best place to find arrowheads. James said little, but he didn't hide in silence either. After breakfast, Martha laid out her plans. She would need supplies from town, fabric for new curtains and shirts for Thomas, seeds for the garden, proper herbs and spices for the kitchen. She would need James to fix the broken fence around the chicken coop and repair the sagging porch step. She would need Thomas to help her with the garden and to practice his letters, which she discovered he could barely read. "You can read?" James asked, surprised. "I was a teacher for 2 years before my father's business failed. Of course I can read. Thomas should be in school, but since there isn't one nearby, I'll teach him myself." James looked uncomfortable. "I can't pay you extra for teaching." "I'm not asking for extra pay. I'm telling you what needs to happen. Your son is 7 years old and can barely write his own name. That's unacceptable." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Martha could see him wrestling with his pride, with his shame at having neglected yet another aspect of his son's care. "All right," he finally said. "You're right. Thank you." The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Martha rose before dawn to start breakfast. James ate quickly and headed out to work the ranch, sometimes with hired hands, sometimes alone. Thomas became Martha's shadow, helping with chores in the morning and sitting at the kitchen table in the afternoon for lessons. She taught him letters and numbers, reading and writing, geography and history. She discovered he had a quick mind and a hunger for knowledge that had been starved for too long. In the evenings, they ate dinner together. James began to speak more, telling stories about the ranch, about the cattle and the land. Thomas would recount what he'd learned that day, proudly showing his father his improving penmanship. And Martha would sit and listen, adding details about her plans for the garden or the preserve she was putting up for winter. The house transformed. Martha sewed new curtains and mended all of Thomas's clothes. She planted a late summer garden and tended it daily, coaxing vegetables from the stubborn soil. She organized the pantry and the root cellar, made lists of what they needed and what they had plenty of. She baked bread twice a week, made butter from the cow's milk, churned ice cream on hot afternoons using ice from the springhouse. Thomas bloomed under her attention like a flower given water. He grew taller, his cheeks filled out, his eyes brightened. He laughed more, played more, seemed more like a child and less like a small adult carrying too much weight. James changed too, though more slowly. The lines around his eyes softened slightly. He began to take more care with his appearance, shaving regularly, changing his clothes more often. He fixed things around the house without being asked: the broken fence, the sagging porch step, a loose board in the barn loft. Small acts of care that suggested he was beginning to re-engage with his life. One evening in late September, after Thomas had gone to bed, Martha sat on the porch with her mending. James came out and sat in the chair beside her, something he'd been doing more often lately. "The house feels different," he said. "It feels alive again. Houses are only as alive as the people in them. Thomas told me today that he doesn't remember being this happy. He said you make everything better." Martha kept her eyes on her stitching. "He's a good boy. He deserves to be happy." "So do you, Miss Caldwell. Are you happy here?" She considered the question. Was she happy? She'd come west expecting marriage and partnership, expecting romance and a new life built with someone who'd chosen her. Instead, she'd found something stranger and more complex. A broken family, a man still half lost in grief, a child starved for affection. She'd found purpose and belonging, but not the kind she'd imagined. "I'm content," she said finally. "I have work that matters and people who need me. That's more than I had in Philadelphia." "But is it what you wanted?" She set down her mending and looked at him. "What I wanted and what I needed turned out to be different things, Mr. Hartley. I'm learning to appreciate that." He nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about what you said when you first arrived, about me not being ready. And you were right. I wasn't ready. I'm not sure I am even now, but I'm better than I was. The house is better. Thomas is better. That's because of you. It's because you let me help. That took courage too." "Did it?" "Seems to me it just took desperation and a very stubborn woman who wouldn't take no for an answer." Martha allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps it took both. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, and another answered. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding beneath them. In the months that followed, as autumn turned to winter and winter to spring, the household continued to settle into itself. Martha taught Thomas to read chapter books and do multiplication. James began consulting her on ranch decisions, valuing her practical mind and organizational skills. They celebrated Thomas's 8th birthday with a cake Martha made from precious sugar and eggs, and the boy declared it the best day of his life. The three of them weren't a conventional family. There was no romance between Martha and James, no grand declarations or stolen kisses. But there was something deeper and perhaps more lasting: respect, partnership, shared purpose. They were three people who'd found each other through accident and desperation, and who'd chosen, day by day, to build something worthwhile from the wreckage of their separate disappointments. One spring evening, as Martha prepared supper and Thomas practiced his letters at the table, James came in from the fields earlier than usual. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching them work in the golden late afternoon light. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice uncertain. "Martha, I've been thinking." She looked up from the stove, where she was stirring gravy. About our arrangement. It's been almost a year now." Martha's heart gave an uncomfortable lurch. Was he going to tell her to leave? Had she failed somehow? Has something changed? Everything's changed. A year ago, this house was dead. Thomas was half wild. I was barely human. Now look at us. Look at what you've built here. "We built it together," she said carefully. "No. You built it. You made this house a home again. You made Thomas into a proper boy with an education and a future. You made me remember what it feels like to live instead of just survive." He took a breath. "I don't want you to be just the housekeeper anymore." Martha felt something flutter in her chest. Hope and fear mingled. "What do you want?" "I want what Thomas has been saying for months now. I want you to be his mother. Not just in practice, but in name. I want you to be my wife, for real this time. Not because I need a housekeeper or because you need employment, but because this family isn't complete without you in it. Because I've come to care for you, and I think maybe you've come to care for us too." Thomas had stopped writing and was watching them with wide, hopeful eyes. Martha set down her spoon and turned to face James fully. "And if I said no? If I wanted to keep things as they are? Then we'd keep them as they are. I'm not trying to trap you or force your hand. I'm just telling you what I want, what I hope. But the choice is yours, Martha. It always has been." She looked at this man who'd brought her west on false pretenses, who'd abandoned her, who'd been too broken to receive the gift she'd tried to give him. But she also saw the man he'd become over the past year. Steadier, stronger, more present. A man who could admit his failures and work to overcome them. A man who loved his son enough to let a stranger into their lives and change everything. And she looked at Thomas, his small face full of desperate hope, this boy she'd come to love as surely as if she'd given birth to him herself. "Ask me properly," she said. James blinked. "What?" "If you're going to propose marriage, Mr. Hartley, do it properly. Not standing in the kitchen doorway like you're halfway ready to run away again." A smile tugged at his lips. He walked across the kitchen and, to her surprise, dropped to one knee. Thomas let out a small gasp of delight. James took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and solid around hers. "Martha Caldwell, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not for convenience or necessity, but because you've brought light back into this house and joy back into our lives? Because I've fallen in love with you somewhere between the biscuits and the teaching lessons and the 100 small kindnesses you've shown us? Because you make the house happy, just like Thomas said, and I don't want to imagine my life without you in it anymore." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. This was what she'd crossed 2,000 miles to find. Not the adventure she'd imagined, not the easy romance of storybooks, but something harder won and more real. A love built on partnership and patience, on shared work and shared purpose. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Thomas hooped and jumped from his chair, running to throw his arms around both of them. They stood there in the kitchen, the three of them tangled together, and Martha felt something she hadn't felt since before her father's death. Complete. Whole. They were married the following month in the simple church in Redemption, with Mrs. Patterson and half the town in attendance. Martha wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric James had insisted on buying, pale blue with white lace at the collar. Thomas stood beside them as witness, his hair slicked down and his new suit crisp and clean. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and James kissed her for the first time, Thomas cheered so loudly that the whole congregation laughed. At the wedding supper, held at the ranch with tables set up under the cottonwood trees, Mrs. Patterson pulled Martha aside. "I'm glad it worked out," she said. "When you rode out there that day, I thought you were crazy. But you were braver than that. You saw what they needed and gave it to them." "They gave me something too," Martha said, watching James and Thomas play horseshoes with some of the ranch hands. "They gave me a purpose, a place to belong. That's what family does, I suppose. Not always the family we expect, but the family we need." Martha nodded, understanding in a way she hadn't when she'd first stepped off that stagecoach into the Texas dust. She'd come west looking for one thing and found something entirely different, entirely better. She'd found a home not through romantic fantasy but through hard work and stubborn determination and the willingness to stay when leaving would have been easier. That night, after the guests had gone and Thomas was asleep in his room, James and Martha stood on the porch looking out at the land. He took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his. "No regrets?" he asked. "Not a single one. You. Only that I didn't have the courage to meet you that first day. Think of all the time we wasted. We didn't waste it. We needed that time to become the people who could make this work. You needed to heal. I needed to stop expecting life to be easy. Thomas needed to see what love looks like when it's patient and persistent." James pulled her close, and she rested her head against his shoulder. Above them, the stars blazed in their familiar patterns, indifferent and eternal. But here, in this small corner of Texas, three people had found their own constellation, their own pattern of belonging. In the years that followed, Martha would often think back to that first day, standing abandoned in the dusty street with a carpetbag and a dream that had already died. She would remember the anger and fear, the humiliation and desperation. But she would also remember the choice she'd made, not to give up, not to accept defeat, but to forge ahead and create something new from the ruins of her expectations. She and James would have 2 more children, daughters who grew up strong and capable under their mother's guidance. Thomas would go to college and become a teacher himself, inspired by the woman who'd refused to let him grow up ignorant and alone. The ranch would prosper under their combined management, Martha's organizational skills complementing James's knowledge of cattle and land. But more than any of these achievements, more than the children or the prosperity or the respect they earned in the community, what Martha would treasure most was the simple truth that Thomas had spoken in his child's wisdom that first day: she makes the house happy. That was what she'd brought to them, and what they'd given back to her in return. Not just a house, but a home. Not just survival, but happiness. Not just an arrangement, but a family. And it had all begun with a 7-year-old boy's plea to his father, with the courage to give love a second chance, and with a woman stubborn enough to stay even when every reason told her to go. The house was happy, and so were they all.